The rest of the lectures from chapter 4 are going to be all about the organelles from eukaryotic cells. You can see in the picture here, we've got a eukaryotic cell, and I can tell you it is an animal cell because it is squishy. It doesn't have any sort of rigid outside, which tells me it doesn't have one of the structures we find in a plant cell, which is a cell wall. We're going to look first at the structures that are found in both plant and animal cells, and then we'll look at the structures that are specifically found just in plant cells. We're going to start off with the big, well-known structure in eukaryotic cells. This is the one that distinguishes eukaryotic cells from prokaryotic cells, and that is the nucleus. So the nucleus is the cell's genetic control center. It has, a lot of important information. It is the largest and most prominent organelle in most eukaryotic cells. In the drawings, you'll notice it is the biggest one usually, big round ball. And when we look at cells underneath the microscope, it's going to be the big part of the cell. Now, in some cells, like plant cells, it won't necessarily be the largest, most easily seen organelle, and we'll talk about that when we get to some of the plant structures, because one of the structures that's found in plants has a tendency to squish the organelles, so we'll talk about that. But usually this is the one that you can find when you're looking at a cell. So what are the functions of the nucleus? Because it is the genetic control center. So one is just that. It is in charge of sending out directions on how to build and control the functions in the cell. So it's got that job because it's the storehouse for hereditary information. So if you remember, the hereditary information, the genetic information, is DNA. And so this is the storehouse for it. This is kind of the lockdown. If you want to think about the nucleus as like the reserve in the library for books, the DNA stays in the nucleus. It's not allowed to leave. The only time we'll see it leave is during cell division, and we'll see why that is the case. But during everyday function of the cell, the DNA has to stay in the nucleus. There are ways to get the information in and out. You saw that in the nucleic acids video. So there is that mRNA that can carry information back and forth, but the DNA is going to stay there to be protected. Otherwise, the nucleus is going to be working to send those directions out. So what does the nucleus look like? Okay, so mentioned, it is the big structure. So it's going to be a big ball structure in a diagram. Now, I'm not concerned about you knowing the nucleolus. That is another structure that's inside of the nucleus, but I'm not concerned about that. You can see that the nucleus is made up of 2 layers of membrane. So it has its own membrane. In fact, all the organelles have a membrane. The nucleus has 2 layers. This adds to its security and stability. But it does have, you can see like these little port bumps all over it. It has nuclear pores, holes, that allow things to come in and out. So this is where like the mRNA would be able to come in and out. And then it is filled with this chromatin or the chromosomes. So this is the DNA that all fills in the inside. So we've got the nucleus. Now we mentioned when we talked about prokaryotes that they have cytoplasm, and they do. So eukaryotes, prokaryotes both have cytoplasm, but we have also in eukaryotes a cytoskeleton. So cytoskeleton does pretty much what it sounds like. It provides support for the cell, and it can also help with the movement of a cell. So you can see in this picture here, a cytoskeleton. These are different fibers that help make up the cytoskeleton, and they go all around and through the cytoplasm. They can be used to transport materials around, but they can also be used to squeeze and release, just like muscles in your, arms and things like that. So they can be used like muscles in a cell to be able to contract and release so that they can, like a cell can kind of squish its way across, say, a slide if we were looking at it underneath a microscope. So we've got the cytoskeleton that can help give it some extra support. Especially this is important for things like animal cells that don't have any sort of strong wall like we saw with prokaryotes. Prokaryotes can have those cell walls or capsules, and we'll see plants have cell walls, and animal cells don't have those. So they can use this cytoskeleton to help strengthen and support the cell. Attached to this cytoskeleton, you'll find sometimes extra structures, just like we saw with the prokaryotes. So eukaryotes can do the same sort of thing. So there are flagella that are found on some of the eukaryotic cells, and they have these, whip-like tails. Their tails work a little differently, so they're made out of different material, but it's the same idea. They use them to swim. And then there are cilia, and cilia are going to mostly be used for most organisms to move fluid and material past cells. They look more like fur, like you can see here. And so these are going to be used more, especially in organisms like ourselves, like I said, to move things past different cells. You're going to see, I'm going to put this link in as one of the videos. This is a video on different organisms with flagella and cilia, so you can see how they're used. We see a lot of flagella with single-celled organisms. The only cell in humans that have flagella are sperm, which is what you're seeing here. We do have cilia in different parts of our bodies. So we do have cilia in things like our lungs, which they'll show you that in that video. So we've got our cytoskeleton, and attached to that can be things like cilia for moving materials around, and sometimes, as you'll see in the video, moving the whole organism around, and then flagella for those tail-like motions to move the cells around. All right, the next organelle is the mitochondria. You may have heard it called the mighty mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. That's a very common, thing for videos and so forth to say. Sorry, I had to do it. But these mitochondria are the energy converters of the cell. So this is where the food that the cell has been processing is going to be sent. So for example, glucose is going to get broken down, and the pieces of it will be sent here to be turned into ATP, into energy. And so this works as kind of an all-purpose converter. It works sort of like a generator, right? So you have a generator on your house, you feed it fuel, it gives you energy, electricity. Same sort of thing here for the mitochondria. You feed it fuel, it gives you energy. And that energy can be used for all sorts of cell functions. And in this picture, you can see the structure of the mitochondria. Talked in an earlier video about the endosymbiosis theory. So these guys have two membranes. That's part of what supports that endosymbiosis theory, that these guys are prokaryotes that got eaten by an ancestral eukaryote. And you can also see the DNA that they have, and you can see it's circular. So they have their own DNA in those circular chromosomes. Trying to think if there's anything else about the mitochondria. Oh, so there is a couple of other things we're going to talk about. One is, I'm sure you've all been told this. How much DNA do you get from each of your parents? My guess is that you said you get half from mom and half from dad. But Turns out we have more DNA from one of our parents than the other. So who is the bigger contributor, mom or dad? And it turns out you get more of your DNA from mom than you do from dad. And you might be going, huh? Why? Yeah, so unfortunately, you have been told some lies. It's easier for us to say that you get half your DNA from each of your parents because as far as your chromosomes go, that is correct. But if you're talking about actual DNA, you're going to get more from your mom, and it's because of these mitochondria. You generally are going to inherit your mitochondria from your mom because your mitochondria and all of your other cell parts come with the egg. The egg is much, much bigger than the sperm. So if you would have, say, this is the egg, this would be the sperm in relative size. Okay, it might be not exact, but you get the idea, right? The egg is much bigger than the sperm because the main thing the sperm has to carry is just the genetic information. But the egg has to have everything else in order to start dividing and creating the cells for the new organism, okay? So you actually do have slightly more DNA from your mom, usually, because you get those mitochondria usually from your mom.